a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and dusty roads, there lived a young woman named Lila. Her days were filled with the sounds of clinking tools, humming engines, and the occasional hiss of steam escaping from a radiator. She spent most of her time in her father's garage, a small but busy place where people brought their broken-down cars, trucks, and even old farming equipment. The garage wasn't fancy, just a roof over some greasy workbenches and piles of spare parts, but it was where Lila felt most at home. It was also where she learned everything she knew about fixing machines. Lila's father, Mr. Thompson, had been a mechanic for as long as anyone could remember. He was known throughout the town for his skill and honesty, always charging fair prices and never taking shortcuts. From the time she was a child, Lila would sit on a stool in the corner of the garage watching her father work. She'd ask questions, tinker with scraps, and slowly, piece by piece, learn how things fit together. By the time she was 10, she could change a tire faster than most adults. By 15, she was rebuilding carburetors without needing help. And now, at 22, she could fix almost anything with an engine, no matter how complicated or worn out it seemed. But not everyone believed in Lila's abilities. Some folks in town thought mechanics were men's work, and they gave her sideways glances when she slid under a car or rolled up her sleeves to get dirty. Others whispered behind her back, saying things like, "She's good for a girl," or "Her dad must be helping her more than she lets on." Lila heard these comments often, but she didn't let them bother her. She knew what she was capable of, and so did her father. To them, it didn't matter what others thought. It only mattered that the job got done right. One sunny afternoon, as Lila tightened the bolts on a pickup truck's exhaust system, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway of the garage. It was unlike any vehicle the town had seen before. Shiny, expensive, and clearly out of place among the rusted tractors and dented sedans parked nearby. The driver stepped out, adjusting his tie as he looked around with an air of superiority. This was Mr. Harlan, a wealthy businessman who rarely visited small towns like this one. His sharp suit and polished shoes made him stand out like a sore thumb, and his presence immediately drew attention from the townspeople passing by. Mr. Harlan walked toward Lila, his expression unreadable but his tone dripping with arrogance. "I hear you're supposed to be the best mechanic in this town," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Lila paused her work, setting down her wrench and standing up straight. She wiped her hands on a rag and met his gaze without flinching. "That's what they say," she replied calmly, though she could feel the weight of curious eyes on her. "Well, I've got a challenge for you," Mr. Harlan continued, smirking slightly. "Something no one else has been able to fix. If you can do it, I'll admit you're as good as they claim, but if you fail—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Lila didn't hesitate. She nodded firmly and extended her hand to shake his. "You've got yourself a deal," she said, her voice steady and confident. The crowd that had gathered outside the garage murmured in surprise. Everyone knew Mr. Harlan's reputation. He was infamous for making impossible demands and mocking those who couldn't meet them. Some of the onlookers exchanged worried glances, thinking Lila might have bitten off more than she could chew. But her father, standing quietly in the background, smiled faintly. He trusted his daughter completely and knew she wouldn't back down from a challenge, no matter how daunting it seemed. Later that day, Mr. Harlan returned with a trailer hitched to his car. On it sat the engine, a mangled mess of twisted metal and shattered components. It looked less like an engine and more like something pulled from a scrapyard after a fire. Lila stared at it for a moment, taking in the extent of the damage. Parts were missing, others were bent beyond recognition, and the whole thing was covered in grime and rust. It was clear why no one else had been able to repair it. Most mechanics would have called it a lost cause and walked away. But Lila wasn't like most mechanics. As she circled the engine, inspecting it closely, her mind began racing with possibilities. She didn't see the wreckage as hopeless. She saw it as a puzzle waiting to be solved. Piece by piece, she started mentally mapping out what needed to be done. She grabbed a notebook and began sketching diagrams, jotting down ideas, and listing the tools and materials she'd need. Her father watched silently, occasionally offering suggestions or handing her tools as she worked. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the garage was alive with activity. Lila moved with purpose, her movements quick and precise despite the complexity of the task ahead. She scavenged parts from old machines stored in the back of the garage, welding together pieces that seemed unusable to anyone else. She worked tirelessly, fueled by determination and the knowledge that this wasn't just about fixing an engine. It was about proving something far greater. As the hours passed, word spread through the town about Lila's challenge. Neighbors stopped by to catch a glimpse of the infamous engine, offering words of encouragement or shaking their heads in disbelief. Some stayed to watch, fascinated by her skill and focus. Even Mr. Harlan made several visits, each time expecting to find her defeated and ready to give up. But every time he showed up, Lila was still hard at work, her face streaked with oil and sweat, but her resolve unshaken. Despite the pressure mounting around her, Lila remained calm and focused. She reminded herself why she had taken on this challenge, not for fame or money, but to show that talent and hard work could overcome even the toughest obstacles. With each passing day, the engine began to take shape again, slowly transforming from a pile of junk into something that resembled its former self. And though the finish line was still far away, Lila knew she was getting closer with every turn of the wrench and every spark of the welder. The second day of the challenge began with the first light of dawn. Lila woke up early, her body aching from the long hours spent bending over the engine the previous day. She stretched briefly, drank a cup of strong coffee her father had brewed, and headed straight to the garage. The townspeople were already gathering outside, curious to see how much progress she had made. Some brought breakfast, plates of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread, while others simply stood by, whispering among themselves. They admired her determination, but couldn't help wondering if she was fighting a losing battle. When Lila stepped into the garage, she found Mr. Harlan waiting for her. He leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, his expression smug. "Still at it, I see," he said, his tone mocking. "I thought you'd have given up by now." Lila ignored him, focusing instead on the engine sitting in the center of the room. It still looked like a disaster, but she could see the faint outlines of hope. The frame was starting to come together, thanks to the late-night welding she had done. She smiled faintly, knowing that even though the task was enormous, she was making progress bit by bit. Harlan circled the engine slowly, shaking his head as if to emphasize how impossible the repair seemed. "You know," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "this thing is beyond saving. Even the best mechanics in the city couldn't fix it. What makes you think you can?" His words hung in the air, heavy and condescending. Lila didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up a wrench and tightened a bolt with deliberate care. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Because I don't give up," she said simply. "And because I believe every problem has a solution." Her answer silenced Harlan for a moment, though his smirk remained. He shrugged, clearly unconvinced, and walked out of the garage. But Lila didn't waste time thinking about him. She rolled up her sleeves and got back to work, determined to prove him wrong. As the morning wore on, she focused on one section of the engine at a time, carefully rebuilding each part. She used her sketches as a guide, referring to them often to ensure she stayed on track. Her hands moved quickly, tightening bolts, aligning gears, and replacing damaged components with salvaged parts. By midday, the heat inside the garage became unbearable. Sweat dripped down Lila's face, mixing with the grease and oil staining her skin. But she didn't stop. Every time she felt tired or frustrated, she reminded herself why she was doing this. Not just to win the challenge, but to show everyone, including herself, what she was truly capable of. Her father occasionally stepped in to help, handing her tools or steadying a piece of metal while she welded it into place. Though he didn't say much, his presence gave her strength. He believed in her completely, and that belief pushed her forward when doubt crept in. As the afternoon dragged on, the crowd outside grew larger. People brought chairs and sat under the shade of nearby trees, chatting and watching Lila work through the open garage doors. Some cheered her on quietly, while others muttered skeptical comments. A few kids played near the driveway, pretending to fix imaginary engines of their own. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement and tension, everyone wondering whether Lila would succeed or fail. One of the spectators, an older man named Mr. Peters, approached the garage during a break. He was a retired mechanic who had once worked alongside Lila's father. With a nod of respect, he handed her a small container of homemade soup. "You're doing great, Lila," he said softly. "Your dad would be proud." Lila accepted the food with a grateful smile, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew these moments of encouragement mattered. They reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila faced her biggest hurdle yet. One of the engine's pistons was too damaged to salvage, and none of the spare parts in the garage matched its specifications. She stared at the broken piece for a long time, frustration bubbling inside her. For a moment she considered giving up. It seemed like an insurmountable problem. But then she remembered something her father had taught her years ago. Sometimes you have to think outside the box. Inspiration struck as she glanced at an old lawnmower sitting in the corner of the garage. Its piston wasn't identical, but with some modification it might work. Lila grabbed the lawnmower and began dismantling it, carefully removing the piston. She measured it against the engine's original part, comparing sizes and shapes. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough. Using a grinder and a file, she reshaped the piston until it fit snugly into place. The process took hours, requiring precision and patience, but by midnight she had successfully installed it. Exhausted but triumphant, she leaned back and let out a deep breath. Another obstacle overcome. As the clock ticked past midnight, Lila finally allowed herself a short rest. She sat on the floor of the garage, her back against the wall, sipping water and staring at the engine. It was still far from complete, but it no longer looked hopeless. Slowly but surely, it was coming back to life. Outside, the crowd had thinned, though a few dedicated supporters remained, keeping watch under the stars. Her father sat nearby, dozing lightly in a chair, his presence a quiet reminder of the love and support surrounding her. Despite the exhaustion weighing her down, Lila felt a spark of hope. She knew the hardest part was yet to come, but she also knew she had the skills and determination to see it through. This engine wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for. And as long as she kept moving forward, one step at a time, she believed she could make it run again. The next morning, when the sun rose over the hills, Lila was already back at work. The engine awaited her, silent and still, but she could almost hear it whispering promises of revival. Piece by piece, she continued to rebuild it, pouring her heart and soul into every detail. The challenge was far from over, but with each passing hour, she grew closer to victory, and to proving that talent and hard work could conquer even the toughest odds. The third day of the challenge started with a sense of urgency in the air. Lila woke up before sunrise, her body stiff and sore from 2 days of relentless work. She didn't complain. Instead, she grabbed another cup of coffee, tied her hair back, and stepped into the garage. The engine sat waiting for her, looking less like a hopeless mess and more like something that could actually run again. But there was still so much to do. Every bolt tightened, every gear aligned brought her closer to finishing, but it also reminded her how far she had yet to go. By now, the entire town seemed to know about the challenge. People streamed into the driveway throughout the morning, some bringing food, others offering words of encouragement. A few even tried to pitch in, holding tools or fetching parts when Lila asked. It felt like the whole community had rallied behind her, united by the belief that she could pull off the impossible. Even those who had doubted her at first were starting to see her determination, and they couldn't help but admire it. Mr. Harlan arrived just after breakfast, stepping out of his shiny car with a look of disbelief on his face. He hadn't expected Lila to last this long. "Still here, I see," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I figured you'd have realized by now that this is a waste of time." Lila glanced up briefly, her hands busy adjusting a valve. "If it's such a waste of time," she replied coolly, "why are you still checking on me?" Harlan frowned, taken aback by her boldness. He muttered something under his breath and walked around the engine, inspecting her progress. Despite himself, he looked impressed, or maybe annoyed, that she had managed to rebuild so much of it. Lila didn't let his presence distract her. She focused on the task at hand, working methodically through her sketches. Today's goal was to tackle the fuel system, which was almost completely destroyed. The carburetor was cracked, the fuel lines were clogged, and the injectors were bent beyond recognition. Most mechanics would have thrown their hands up in frustration, but Lila saw it as another puzzle to solve. She rummaged through the piles of spare parts in the garage, searching for anything usable. When she came up short, she improvised, fashioning makeshift components from scraps she found lying around. Her creativity amazed everyone who watched. One man in the crowd whispered to his neighbor, "She's not just fixing it, she's reinventing it." Lila overheard the comment and smiled faintly, though she didn't stop working. She knew she wasn't just repairing an engine, she was proving a point. This wasn't about money or fame. It was about showing that skill and hard work mattered, more than privilege or resources, and if she succeeded, no one would ever doubt her again. As the hours passed, the heat inside the garage grew unbearable. The sun blazed down, turning the metal walls into radiators. Sweat poured down Lila's face, soaking her shirt and stinging her eyes. She wiped her forehead with a dirty rag and kept going, refusing to slow down. Her father stood nearby, fanning, himself with a piece of cardboard and occasionally handing her tools. He wanted to tell her to take a break, but he knew better. Lila wouldn't stop, not until the job was done. Around midday, disaster struck. As Lila tested the newly rebuilt fuel pump, a loud pop echoed through the garage. Smoke billowed out, and she jumped back, startled. The crowd gasped, fearing the worst. For a moment, panic flickered in Lila's eyes. Had all her hard work been ruined? She knelt beside the engine, inspecting the damage. A small leak had caused the pressure to build up, blowing out a seal she thought was secure. It wasn't catastrophic, but it meant hours of extra work to fix. Instead of getting discouraged, Lila took a deep breath and got back to work. She replaced the faulty seal and reinforced the connections, making sure nothing like that would happen again. Her calm reaction reassured the crowd, who had been holding their breath. They admired her resilience, the way she faced setbacks without losing hope. To them, she wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a symbol of grit and perseverance. Evening approached. Lila reached another milestone, the electrical system. The wiring harness was a tangled mess of frayed cables and melted insulation. Sorting it out required patience and precision, two things Lila had in abundance. She carefully untangled each wire, testing its continuity with a multimeter. Some wires were too damaged to save, so she spliced in new ones, soldering the connections and wrapping them tightly with electrical tape. By the time she finished, the wiring looked almost brand new. Outside, the crowd began to thin as families headed home for dinner. But a few loyal supporters stayed behind, lighting lanterns and setting them around the garage to keep Lila company. Among them was Mrs. Carter, the owner of the local bakery, who brought fresh pies and pastries. "You're doing incredible, dear," she said, placing a plate of apple turnovers on a nearby table. "Don't forget to eat something." Lila thanked her warmly, taking a quick bite before returning to the engine. These small acts of kindness kept her going, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Late into the night, Lila tackled the final major hurdle, the timing belt. This part of the engine was critical. If it wasn't installed perfectly, the pistons could collide with the valves, causing catastrophic damage. She double-checked her measurements, aligning the camshaft and crankshaft with painstaking accuracy. Then, using a special tool she had borrowed from her father's toolbox, she carefully slid the belt into place. It was a delicate operation, requiring steady hands and nerves of steel. When she finally secured the belt, she let out a sigh of relief. The hardest parts were behind her now. As midnight approached, Lila allowed herself a brief moment of rest. She sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping water and staring at the engine. It looked different now, not perfect, but functional. The once broken machine was slowly coming back to life, thanks to her relentless effort. Outside, the remaining spectators whispered among themselves, marveling at what they had witnessed. No one doubted anymore whether Lila could finish the job. They only wondered how amazing the result would be. Her father joined her, sitting quietly beside her. "You've done incredible work, sweetheart," he said softly. "Your mother would be so proud." Lila smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She missed her mom, who had passed away years ago, but tonight she felt close to her. She imagined her mom cheering her on, just like the rest of the town. With renewed energy, Lila got back to work. There were still minor adjustments to make, loose ends to tie up, but she could feel the end in sight. Piece by piece, hour by hour, she was breathing life back into the engine. The challenge wasn't over yet, but she was closer than ever to victory, and to proving that talent and hard work could conquer even the toughest odds. The fourth day of the challenge began with a quiet determination in the air. Lila woke up earlier than usual, her body aching and her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She knew the finish line was near, but the final stretch would demand everything she had left. The engine was almost complete. It could almost breathe again, but there were still critical details to address. Every connection, every adjustment, mattered now more than ever. One wrong move could undo all her hard work. As she stepped into the garage, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the open doors, she found the townspeople already waiting for her. Some brought coffee and breakfast, while others simply stood by, watching with hopeful eyes. Word of her progress had spread even further, drawing curious visitors from neighboring areas. A local radio station had even mentioned her story that morning, calling her the mechanic who won't quit. Lila appreciated the support, but she didn't let it distract her. Her focus remained on the engine sitting before her, silent and still but full of potential. Mr. Harlan arrived shortly after sunrise, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. He looked around the garage, taking in the scene, the crowd, the lanterns glowing softly in the corners, and the engine itself, which now looked remarkably close to being functional. His expression betrayed a flicker of unease, though he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "Still hanging. In there, I see," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough if all this effort was worth it." Lila didn't bother responding. She was too busy double-checking her sketches and gathering the tools she'd need for the day. Harlan lingered for a few minutes, trying to rattle her confidence with snide remarks, but Lila ignored him completely. She had no time for his games. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, fine-tuning the engine's components to ensure they worked together seamlessly. Her first priority that morning was the cooling system. The radiator was cracked and the hoses were brittle and worn. Without a functioning cooling system, the engine would overheat within minutes of running. Lila inspected each part carefully, replacing damaged sections with salvaged materials. She patched the radiator using a welding technique her father had taught her years ago, creating a seal so strong it seemed like new. When she reattached the hoses, she made sure every connection was tight and secure. By mid-morning, the cooling system was ready to go. Next, she turned her attention to the exhaust manifold. It was warped and leaking, a problem that could reduce the engine's efficiency and cause dangerous back pressure. Using a combination of heat and careful hammering, Lila reshaped the metal until it fit snugly against the cylinder head. She replaced the gasket and tightened the bolts with precision, ensuring there were no leaks. As she worked, the crowd outside grew restless, eager to see the engine come to life. But Lila remained calm, moving deliberately through each step. By lunchtime, the atmosphere in the garage shifted. People began speculating about how much longer it would take. Some guessed hours, others thought days. Lila didn't pay attention to their chatter. She was deep in concentration, her hands steady as she adjusted the throttle linkage and calibrated the fuel injectors. These final tweaks required pinpoint accuracy, and she refused to rush. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature inside the garage climbed higher. The sun blazed down, turning the space into an oven. Sweat dripped down Lila's face, mixing with grease and oil. Her clothes clung to her skin, heavy and uncomfortable, but she didn't stop. When someone offered her a cold drink, she accepted gratefully but kept working. There was no room for breaks. Not now. Not when she was so close. Around 4 o'clock, Mr. Harlan returned, this time accompanied by 2 men in suits. They introduced themselves as engineers from the city, sent by Harlan to evaluate Lila's progress. Their presence felt like another attempt to intimidate her, but Lila didn't flinch. She greeted them politely, then went back to work, ignoring their skeptical glances. One of the engineers leaned in to inspect the engine, muttering under his breath about how unconventional some of her methods were. Lila heard him, but chose not to respond. She knew her techniques might not follow textbook rules, but they worked, and that was all that mattered. As evening fell, the crowd outside swelled once again. People brought chairs and blankets, settling in for what they hoped would be the final stages of the challenge. Children played nearby, mimicking the sounds of revving engines, while adults exchanged stories about Lila's incredible journey. The mood was electric, filled with anticipation and pride. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when the impossible became possible. Lila, however, stayed grounded. She knew better than to celebrate prematurely. With the major repairs complete, she moved on to testing and troubleshooting. She connected a battery to the engine and began checking for issues, listening closely for strange noises or signs of trouble. When she noticed a faint hissing sound coming from one of the vacuum lines, she traced it back to a loose fitting. Tightening it resolved the issue, but it reminded her to stay vigilant. Even the smallest oversight could ruin everything. By 9 o'clock, the engine was nearly ready. All that remained was the final assembly and startup test. Lila gathered the last few tools she needed and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. She called her father over to help stabilize the engine while she made the final adjustments. Together, they worked in perfect harmony, their movements synchronized after years of working side by side. When everything was in place, Lila stepped back and surveyed her work. The engine looked different now, not shiny or new, but solid and dependable. It bore the marks of its battle scars, but it also carried the promise of revival. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a surge of pride. What had once been declared unfixable was now standing tall, thanks to her relentless effort and ingenuity. The crowd sensed the significance of the moment and fell silent. Dozens of eyes were fixed on Lila as she reached for the key and inserted it into the ignition. Her heart pounded as she turned it slowly, holding her breath. At first, nothing happened. Then came a low rumble, a hesitant growl that grew louder and steadier with each passing second. The engine roared to life, its sound echoing through the garage and spilling out into the night. For a moment, no one spoke. The crowd stared in awe as the engine purred smoothly, its vibrations steady and strong. Then cheers erupted, loud, joyful, and unstoppable. People clapped, whistled, and shouted, congratulating Lila on her remarkable achievement. Her father hugged her tightly, tears glistening in his eyes. Even Mr. Harlan, standing off to the side, looked stunned. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Lila smiled faintly, feeling a mix of relief and triumph wash over her. She had done it. Against all odds, she had fixed the impossible engine. But as the celebration continued around her, she remained humble, knowing that this victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had supported her along the way, to her father, to the townspeople, and to anyone who believed in the power of hard work and determination. The roar of the engine filled the air, a deep and steady sound that seemed to echo far beyond the garage. It was alive, breathing, humming, and running as if it had never been broken. The crowd outside erupted into cheers, their voices blending with the rhythmic growl of the machine. Lila stood beside it, her hands resting lightly on the frame, feeling its vibrations like a heartbeat beneath her palms. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to fully absorb what she had accomplished. The impossible had been fixed. not by luck or magic, but by sheer willpower and skill. Mr. Harlan stood frozen near the entrance of the garage, his face pale and his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't explain, or didn't want to believe. His two engineers shifted uncomfortably beside him, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. One of them muttered quietly, "She actually did it." Harlan shot him a sharp look, silencing him instantly, but the damage was done. Doubt crept into his expression, mingling with disbelief and perhaps even a hint of respect. Lila ignored him for now. She turned instead to the townspeople gathered outside, their faces glowing with pride and admiration. Some clapped enthusiastically, while others simply stared in awe, unable to find the right words to express what they had just seen. Children ran up to her, tugging at her sleeves and asking how she had managed to bring the engine back to life. She knelt down to their level, smiling warmly despite her exhaustion. "It's all about patience and believing you can do it," she told them. "Even when things seem impossible, there's always a way." Her father stepped forward then, placing a hand on her shoulder. His eyes were wet with tears, though he tried to hide it by clearing his throat loudly. "You've made us proud, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would have been cheering louder than anyone here today." Lila nodded, blinking back her own tears. She thought about her mom often, especially during tough moments like this one. Knowing that her mom would have been proud gave her strength even when she felt like giving up. As the celebration continued, people began filing into the garage to get a closer look at the engine. They marveled at how Lila had pieced it together, using scraps and ingenuity, transforming a hopeless wreck into something functional and strong. Mr. Peters, the retired mechanic, examined it closely, nodding approvingly. "This isn't just a repair," he said, turning to Lila. "This is art. You didn't just fix it. You rebuilt it better than before." His words brought a wave of applause from the crowd, and Lila felt a warmth spread through her chest. Recognition like this meant more to her than any prize or paycheck ever could, but not everyone was ready to celebrate just yet. Mr. Harlan finally found his voice, stepping forward with an awkward cough to regain control of the situation. "Well," he began, his tone strained, "I suppose I should admit that you handled yourself well." He stumbled over the words, clearly struggling to acknowledge her victory. The crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what he would say next. "But let's be clear," he added quickly, regaining some of his usual arrogance. "This doesn't mean you're better than professional mechanics. This was just a lucky break." His attempt to downplay her achievement only made the crowd angrier. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the group and several people shook their heads in frustration. Lila, however, remained calm. She straightened up, meeting Harlan's gaze directly. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. "What you call lucky is years of hard work, learning from mistakes and refusing to give up, even when everyone tells me I can't win." Her words resonated deeply, earning nods of agreement from those around her. Harlan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, someone in the crowd shouted, "Why don't you try fixing something like this yourself? Or are you too busy wearing fancy suits?" Laughter broke out among the townspeople, lightening the mood and putting Harlan further on edge. He clenched his jaw, clearly realizing he was outnumbered. After a moment of hesitation, he forced a tight smile and gestured toward the engine. "Fine. You proved your point," he said stiffly. "Congratulations." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the garage, followed by his engineers, leaving behind a trail of murmurs and chuckles. Once he was gone, the celebration resumed with renewed energy. People crowded around Lila, shaking her hand, patting her on the back, and offering heartfelt congratulations. Someone brought out a cake decorated with tiny edible tools, a playful nod to her mechanical skills. Lila laughed, accepting a slice gratefully. As she ate, she listened to the stories people shared about their favorite moments from the challenge, the late-night welding sessions, the clever fixes, and the unwavering determination that kept her going. It felt surreal to think that her, Battle with the engine had become such a source of inspiration for so many. By midnight, the crowd began to thin as families headed home, exhausted but happy. A few close friends and neighbors stayed behind to help clean up the garage, which was now littered with empty plates, tools, and discarded rags. Lila joined them, sweeping the floor and organizing her workspace. Despite her fatigue, she felt a strange sense of peace. The weight of the challenge had lifted, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had given everything she had, and succeeded. When the last person left, Lila sat down on a stool, staring at the engine one final time. It hummed, softly, idling steadily as if grateful for its second chance. She ran her fingers along its surface, tracing the welds and patches that told the story of its rebirth. Each mark was a reminder of the obstacles she had overcome, the doubts she had silenced, and the dreams she had pursued relentlessly. This wasn't just an engine anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of believing in oneself. Her father joined her, sitting quietly beside her. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you've done more than fix an engine tonight. You've shown everyone here, and maybe even yourself, that talent doesn't care about titles or money. It cares about heart." Lila smiled, leaning, her head against his shoulder. She knew he was right. This challenge had been about proving something, not just to others, but to herself. And now, as she looked at the engine and thought about everything she had endured to bring it back to life, she realized she had proven far more than she ever imagined. The night grew quieter as the stars twinkled overhead. The garage was dark except for the soft glow of a single lantern hanging from the ceiling. Outside, the town slept peacefully, unaware of the impact Lila's victory would have in the days to come. Mechanics from nearby cities would soon arrive, eager to meet the girl who had conquered the impossible. Word of her triumph would spread, bringing new opportunities and challenges her way. But for now, Lila was content to sit in silence, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the love of her community. She glanced at her father, then back at the engine. Tomorrow would bring fresh starts and new adventures, but tonight belonged to rest and reflection. As she closed her eyes, lulled by the gentle hum of the engine, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for her family, her friends, and the unshakable belief that anything was possible if you refused to quit. The days following the challenge brought a wave of change to Lila's life. News of her incredible feat spread far beyond the small town, reaching newspapers, radio stations, and even social media. People from neighboring cities drove hours just to see the engine that had been declared unfixable, and to meet the young woman who had defied all odds. The garage, once quiet and modest, became a bustling hub of activity. Strangers arrived daily, some seeking advice, others asking for repairs they believed only Lila could handle. Her father joked that they needed to expand the space just to fit everyone in, but fame didn't change Lila. She remained the same hard-working, humble mechanic she had always been. Each morning, she woke up early, drank her coffee, and got straight to work. The engine that had started it all now sat proudly in the corner of the garage, a testament to what determination and skill could achieve. Visitors often asked if she planned to sell it or display it somewhere special, but Lila shook her head. "It belongs here," she said simply. "This is where its story began, and this is where it stays." Despite the influx of attention, Lila found time to reflect on what the challenge had taught her. It wasn't just about fixing an engine, it was about proving something deeper, that talent comes in many forms, and success isn't measured by wealth or status, but by effort and heart. She thought about Mr. Harlan's skepticism and how his doubt had fueled her drive. In a way, she was grateful for his challenge because it pushed her to dig deeper than she ever had before. Still, she hoped he had learned something too, that underestimating someone based on appearances or background was a mistake no one should make twice. A few weeks later, Mr. Harlan returned unexpectedly. This time, he came alone, without his polished shoes or smug demeanor. He walked into the garage quietly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. Lila looked up from the car she was working on and raised an eyebrow. "Back again?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Harlan nodded, shuffling his feet awkwardly. I wanted to apologize, he admitted after a pause. His words hung in the air, surprising both of them. Lila set down her wrench and wiped her hands on a rag. Apologize for what? She asked, though she already knew. Harlan sighed, glancing around the garage as if searching for the right words. For doubting you, he said finally, and for thinking I knew better than everyone else. You proved me wrong, in more ways than one. He extended his hand tentatively, waiting to see how she would respond. After a moment, Lila shook his hand firmly. Apology accepted, she said with a small smile. But don't let it happen again. Harlan chuckled nervously, looking relieved. They talked briefly about the engine and how it continued to run smoothly despite its rough beginnings. Before leaving, Harlan promised to send more business her way, not out of pity, but because he genuinely believed she deserved it. As he drove off, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Even the hardest critics could learn to appreciate true skill when they saw it. With the challenge behind her, Lila focused on building her future. Word of her success attracted not only customers but also opportunities she hadn't dreamed of. A local technical school invited her to teach a workshop on creative problem-solving in mechanics. At first she hesitated, unsure if she was qualified to stand in front of a classroom, but her father encouraged her, reminding her that sharing knowledge was just as important as gaining it. Reluctantly, she agreed, and quickly discovered she loved teaching. Her students admired her practical approach and real-world examples, and many stayed after class to ask questions or thank her for inspiring them. As months passed, Lila's reputation grew. She received offers to speak at conferences, write articles for trade magazines, and even host her own TV segment on automotive repair. While some proposals excited her, others felt overwhelming. She turned down anything that took her away from the garage for too long, knowing her roots were tied to the place where she had grown up and learned everything she knew. Her father joked that she was becoming a celebrity, but Lila brushed it off. I'm still just a mechanic, she told him. That's all I'll ever be. Her impact reached beyond her career. Young girls in the town began stopping by the garage, eager to learn about engines and tools. Some wanted to follow in her footsteps, while others simply sought advice on pursuing their dreams. Lila welcomed them all, teaching them basic skills and encouraging them to believe in themselves. She remembered how isolating it had felt to be doubted because of her gender, and she vowed never to let anyone else experience that. To her, every child who left the garage inspired was another victory. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Lila sat outside with her father, watching the stars appear one by one. The garage lights flickered softly behind them, casting a warm glow over the driveway. You've done more than fix engines, you know, her father said, breaking the comfortable silence. You've given people hope. That's a rare gift. Lila smiled, leaning back in her chair. She didn't think of herself as extraordinary, just someone who loved what she did and refused to give up. But hearing her father's words made her realize how much her journey had touched others. In the end, the impossible engine became more than a machine. It became a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of believing in oneself. For Lila, it was proof that no challenge was too great if approached with determination and heart. And for the townspeople, it was a reminder that greatness often comes from unexpected places, carried by those brave enough to rise above doubt and prove their worth. Years later, when people spoke of Lila Thompson, they didn't just talk about her skill with engines. They talked about her courage, her kindness, and her unwavering belief that anything was possible. They remembered the girl who had taken on the impossible and won, not for glory but for the sheer joy of doing what she loved. And through it all, Lila remained exactly who she had always been. A mechanic with grease-stained hands, a brilliant mind, and a heart big enough to inspire an entire community.